Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Day Two of the State of Energy Research Conference, Accelerating Research for a Speedy Energy Transition. I'm Professor Peta Ashworth from the University of Queensland and have had a wonderful privilege of working with the team to bring the conference to you. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and I pay our respects to ancestors and their descendants. For me, it's the Jagera and the Turrbal people who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners across Australia from where we are all dialing in. Would like to thank our sponsors who have supported this event. Very importantly, our platinum sponsor Ongi and our silver sponsors, Race for 2030 CRC, Energy Consumers Australia, and the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Because without them, obviously we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing today. I think we've got a really exciting lineup of speakers for you. We're starting off with a keynote with Lynne Gallagher, followed up by some speakers, Catherine Woodthorpe and John Utzon, and then an interesting panel after that. So we'll move in between these different sessions with a strong focus, I think, on the role of the consumer and people and environmental justice when we're thinking about that. But I've sort of been tasked to give a few reflections. And I guess so recently after COP26, I did really want to share this quote that Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, spoke about, where he said, "The sirens are sounding. Our planet is talking to us and telling us something, and so are people everywhere. Climate action tops the list of people's concerns across country, age and gender, and we must listen, and we must act, and we must choose wisely." And I think that echoes this idea of speeding up the transition. What is it that we need to do to move forward to 2030 and beyond? And we were very fortunate to hear from Drew Clark yesterday around the energy transition and the work that Ecole has done. And some of the things that we take away is this, everyone's turning to net zero, but what does that really mean? When we talk about energy, we're operating in a complex system, which is really challenging in its own right about what comes in, inputs and outputs. But also I think, Drew stressed the importance of interdisciplinarity in solving these problems and, of course, the need for social sciences, which of course is music to my ears as a social scientist. But also we heard from Mark Howden, who's a long-term friend and colleague from days at CSIRO, where he really emphasised the challenge between mitigation and adaptation. And if we don't get that right, then whatever we don't mitigate, then it's going to put more pressure on adaptation. And I would encourage us all to think about that. And especially if we're thinking about what's already happening, where we're seeing some of the impacts more broadly. And I was very fortunate this morning because in my role as director of the Liveris Academy, we hosted a breakfast between Andrew Liveris and the US Ambassador Sitadinis today, looking at some of these challenges. And one of them, of course, was climate change. And Andrew talked about being at COP and how he felt that businesses really grabbed the agenda. And I think this is something to think about as we move forward, businesses helping government to get to net zero. And that's something that perhaps we haven't seen such an emphasis on. And he also talked about sustainability being a business driver that actually has a planetary purpose, that people are really changing the way that they think about ESG. And actually, it's all very well to have strategies, but execution is a strategy itself. And I thought that really highlighted exactly what we're talking about here with this, how do we speed up the transition? I would like to just reflect a little bit on the social sciences, because obviously it's an area that I've worked on in a long time, over a long period of time. And when we talk about some of the things that we look at there, whether it's just the social acceptance, social license to operate, which we know in many companies now, in all sorts of energy forms, it's been identified as a commercial showstopper. And then also this need for energy literacy. And one of my Liveris scholars who's actually attending the conference as a student of the UQ Student Energy Network, he talked about this idea of how do we make sure we can bring more of the Australian public along. And I think this is a challenge. It will be interesting to hear the reflections around consumers today. But I guess the other thing that I grapple with, when I look at our solar farm and so forth, what is the scale up that how are we going to achieve this scale up? When you think about 5 gigawatts of solar or 5 gigawatts of renewable energy, what does that really look like and where is it going to go? Now, there's lots of plans and so forth, but I think when you bring in the public, even when we opened the Warwick Solar Farm or were deploying that, there was concerns. The UQ was called an environmental vandal, which was quite a surprise to me, because when we do our national surveys across the world, everybody loves renewable energy. It's the solution. But what actually happened when we started to unpick it was all to do with livelihoods and lifestyles. And so I think it's why it's going to be really important when we hear from our keynote today around this idea of, you know, the consumer role and what do we need to do. The other thing that I would also like to, you know, when we think about social license to operate, I heard a beautiful quote from someone who'd been working in the wind industry. And they talked about social license to operate. We should treat it like a garden. It needs to be tended and you cannot let it grow over. And I'd like you to think about that in the realms of energy and deploying energy technologies, because I think it's actually really true here that we're working through projects, and as they grow, we have to make sure we bring all of society along with us. The other thing is that recently we did some citizens panels, and this was to look at the role of future fuels. And when we actually unpicked some of the key themes, we ran them across Greater Melbourne, the Illawarra, and also South Australia. When we looked at what they saw as being important to be able to transition, things that came through loud and clear was the need for safety, the impacts on personal costs and finance, the need for reliability and security of supply, which is something we're very blessed with here in Australia, employment and training and the opportunities that are coming up with reskilling, as well as other social considerations, which we'll talk about more today. You know, what about people that are renters or people from lower socioeconomic? And encouragingly, I think the need for investment in research and development. So one of the things that comes up a lot when we're talking about transition, and in some states, people tend not to use the word transition because it sometimes can have a negative connotation. But if you look at the report from the UNFCCC around just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs, I think it was page 18.44, they talked here, and I'll just read it. 2 challenges that must be addressed in this context concern geographical and temporal disconnects. The low carbon economy may not create, and in brackets, sufficient numbers of jobs in the locations where jobs are lost in the conventional economy. Likewise, green jobs creation may not happen at the same time or at the same pace as conventional job losses occur. So to the extent possible, these disconnects need to be bridged by transition policies in order to minimise dislocation and human suffering. And I really believe that's a core part of when we think about the role of energy research, working with policy, working with industry, is how do we help to manage that so that we can see where the skills, where jobs are being lost and where opportunities might emerge. And one of the things that came through today in this sort of transition discussion was with the onset of digital transformation, be it through artificial intelligence, the future of work, cybersecurity and so forth. While this might mean some jobs are lost, what we need to identify is where are those opportunities, because there are new opportunities. So we might lose one type of job, but there are others. And I think the opportunity that it presents for reskilling and for all of these sort of transitions is actually where we need to be focusing our attention. I think the other thing that's come through loud and clear is price on carbon. And that's an interesting one. But as I'm sure as Europe's going to introduce a carbon border adjustment measure, then here in Australia, we're going to have to do something about that. So what is the best way to think about how we implement those? I think it's got to be a strategic approach, but it has to be executed well, because there'll always be winners and losers. But if we can take a market approach to this, then maybe that might help build out some of those challenges. Quite interestingly, and I would love to get some audience participation here. Last night, I received an email from one of my colleagues who does a lot of work in the energy research and social science space, but Benjamin Sovercool. And if many of you are on his email, you probably got it. He's very good at promoting his publications. But it was something that he did. He published in collaboration with Alexander Dunlap, a postdoctoral fellow. And the title really grabbed my attention: Anarchy, War or Revolt, radical perspectives for climate protection, insurgency, and civil disobedience in a low-carbon era. And so it raised to me, it was really sort of what they were doing was actually looking at where insurgents had occurred across the world, what were some of the motivations right back through to world wars and so forth. And he talked about the radical tactics that might be adopted for those that are seeking transformational action on climate or environmental sustainability. And so I would commend that to you. I wonder if anyone is able to put anything in the chat here, I'm not sure, but what you thought might be on their inventory, because they actually finished up with 20, a list of 20 of key things that they thought might comprise that anarchy. I don't know if I can see that from here or not. I'm just going to open up the discussion forum, but it would be lovely to hear some of your thoughts around what do you think might be on that list? I can tell you the first one at one end is witnessing and watching, so documenting the injustices or unsustainable practice, which I think we're seeing a lot in some of our NGO work and other industry, the United Nations and so forth. At the very end, the bottom end is bombing, which was a bit of a surprise to me. So detonating incendiary devices to injure or kill or destroy property. And I'm just thinking about what does that mean from an energy transition point of view? And I guess if we think about some of the technologies and so forth, is it out of the realm? I guess I'd encourage you to think about that. So when I think about social license to operate, I suppose I often get caught in with governments when things are not going so well. And when we think about the transition, there's so many parts to this transition, whether it is the implementation of the new tech, the digital tech, if we think about transmission lines, if we're going all electric, pipelines, if we're needing them for hydrogen and so forth. There are some real issues when we think about that, but also if we think about the low socioeconomic, what happens to those and where do we go with that? And so I guess these are some of the considerations when we're thinking forward to our speakers today. What is it that we need to do to go forward? Yeah, so the other thing, that was probably most of the comments that I wanted to make to open this session up. As I said, we're going to hear very soon from Lynne Gallagher, from the Chief Executive Officer of Energy Consumers Australia. And then we'll follow on with plenary speakers from the Race for 2030 CRC. So I'll just quickly bring up, for those of you that don't know Lynne, she is an economist and an econometrician by qualification and has substantial experience in economic modelling and policy reform processes, including working with the Council of Australian Government and in strategic issues and management in the corporate sector. She spent, I don't know if someone can hear that, but she spent 15 years in technical environment, followed by 12 years in practice and as an advisor. Prior to her appointment at ECA's Director of Research, Lynne was Executive Director in Industry Development at Energy Networks Australia, and she brings ECA's strong insights, a strategic focus, and a consumer advocacy perspective. So we might just hand over there. She'll be presenting a secret to great energy research. We don't know, and please feel free to use the discussion forum to have any discussions with other attendees. So I might just leave it over there as we bring in Lynne to start in a minute or so. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Peter, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm mindful that it's important that I use this platform to speak to the role of the consumer in the future energy transition. I wanted to first comment on the overarching conference theme, which is accelerating research for a speedy energy transition. And if I take the second part of that sentence first, the goal of a speedy energy transition, I think it's critical to acknowledge that as fossil fuels are inevitably phased out economy-wide, our energy will be largely supplied by our electricity system. At Energy Consumers Australia, we describe this transition as happening at two scales. The first transition is the replacement of large-scale centralised fossil fuel generation with lower cost renewable options and the proliferation of battery storage. But the second transition is largely driven by consumer adoption of rooftop solar, residential and neighbourhood battery storage, and electrification of transport and heating in homes. So far, so good. However, as a natural contrarian, I wanted you to know that I only reached the first word of the conference theme before realising I needed to stop you all right there. While I share the sense of urgency for research to support the decarbonisation of our energy system within the 2050 timeframe, it isn't the pace of research that's the challenge when it comes to the part people, society, and institutions are being asked to play as part of the energy system transition. Rather than accelerating research, to my mind, the goal has to be to close the gap between our knowledge of potential changes in social practice, culture, business models, and infrastructure with the engineering, technology, and market design possibilities for our future electricity system. Today, I want to talk about the challenges in achieving this goal and the great things we might accomplish if we engage in just a little course correction. To go fast, go alone, it is said. To go far, go together. This quote, usually attributed as an African proverb, has become a bit of a mantra in circles where smart people are trying to tackle some of the world's most complex problems. In the context of the future of our energy system, I like this aphorism. It hints at some of the things I think we routinely overlook. For those of us in the energy system, net zero will mean a transition to a 100% renewable grid and a huge push towards the electrification of everything. And we have a prevailing view about how to get there. Our journey will be led by technology, we're told, by innovation, by engineering, and by science. But achieving these goals will not constitute, on its own, a successful transition. You see, it's not just whether we get to net zero that matters. It's also how we get to net zero that is important to households, small businesses, and large commercial and industrial users for whom electricity is essential. Electricity remains expensive, and the energy divide between households is widening. Consumers, however, expect a better future in which energy is not only clean, but is also abundant and affordable, including for those experiencing vulnerability and hardship. It is also a future in which their values, including agency and fairness, are respected, and where there is reciprocity, so that industry, government, and consumers all play their part in the transition. To go far, we need to go together, and we need to arrive together too. This kind of thinking is now commonplace when it comes to wicked problems and complex systems, to tackling the kind of challenges that involve an interconnected web of actors, many of whom want and need different, often competing things. It's not the way we often think about research, though. When it comes to research, our minds often turn towards brilliant individuals or small teams, deeply immersed in their subject matter, and leveraging their expertise to answer questions that mere mortals can barely comprehend. The truth, of course, is we've mostly moved well beyond that. As researchers now, we know that the old myth of research for research's sake is gone. Our institutions, our funders, and our society expect and demand more from us. Research must be applied to real-world problems. It must have demonstrable real-world impact. I know you will probably feel that pressure. These things are important, but again, they're not enough. They are necessary, but can never be sufficient, because they should always lead to the next questions. Real-world problems for who? Real-world impact for who? Let's think for a moment about how things often work. A researcher scans the energy space looking for a problem. They ask people in the industry what is needed. What would make the system more efficient? What would deliver more value? Then we fall back upon disciplinary perspectives, the hammer that makes everything look like a nail. If you're an economist like me, it's going to be about modelling, about incentives and disincentives, price signals, and so forth. If you're an engineer or a technology designer, hey, let's build something. If you're a chemist, maybe the answer lies with, you guessed it, chemistry. We start with our articulation of the problem, and then we hypothesize and test next stop solutions. But we're not mad scientists working alone in a lab. Collaboration matters, right? So we come together. One team of researchers joins with another team from a different university or organisation. Maybe they involve some system actors. Let's consult with industry on this particular project. It's probably the same ones we talked to when framing the original problem. Together, we collaborate for impact, creating an innovation, generating some insights. And then, you just can't launch that research into the world, right? You'll need to do some consultation. So with your finished research output, you come to an organisation like Energy Consumers Australia and say, you represent consumers. We've created this thing. Will people like it? Will they use it? Will they mind? And we probably say, we don't know. With the greatest of respect, I'm here to tell you one thing I do know. There are better ways of doing this. Too many of the collaborations we see might be better described as a group of similar people with similar backgrounds and similar ways of seeing the world, using similar approaches to tackle a problem they themselves have identified and defined. That's not what we need to navigate complex socio-technical transition. As the leader of an organisation that exists to provide evidence-based policy and advocacy in the energy market, as well as carrying out and commissioning research ourselves, Energy Consumers Australia has a great vantage point to see where some of the gaps are. And despite all of the research we carry out, fund and collaborate on, the most frequent answer to the questions we get asked is, we don't know. How much control of their own smart appliances or rooftop solar would people be prepared to give up in exchange for a more reliable system? We don't know. Are most people interested in energy independence and looking to one day add a battery in their garage? Or will more people lean towards local resilience and are waiting to enthusiastically adopt shared storage like neighbourhood batteries? We don't know. As Australia transitions to a nation of electric vehicles, when and where will our cars be charged? Will we be using more electricity at peak times? Or will people have shifted consumption to during the day? Guess what? We don't know. The reason we don't know relates more to the size and scope of the task than because we don't research people. We regularly ask households and small businesses about their attitudes and their choices in the energy system now and into the future in our energy consumer sentiment and consumer behaviour surveys. But researching people is a whole of system task, not just a task for an organisation that has consumers in its title. So much of the research we currently see, carried out by brilliant people with excellent intentions, begins by either excluding consumers or by making assumptions about what they want and need in relation to their energy. When it comes to research, there's a huge amount that's needed across a range of social science and transition design disciplines to help us better understand what consumers want, what they need, and what they do, to start filling in some of those we don't know spaces. But if you're a data scientist, an engineer, a technology or software designer, that doesn't mean you're off the hook, because that thing that you're working on, sooner or later, is going to run headfirst into the consumers who make up the energy system. And if that's the first time you've given a thought to them, chances are it's not going to work how you intended. If I sound frustrated, I'm not. I'm actually excited. Why? Medieval cartographers used to write "Here be dragons" on the parts of the map that were to them unknown. On the glorious, messy map that is our complex energy system, there might as well be inky sections marked "Here be consumers." Those old map makers assumed that what they didn't understand was scary, an inconvenience, or worse, a threat. But in reality, that's where the opportunity lay. That was the exciting part. Because when it comes to carrying out the kind of research that will change the world and change people's lives for the better, it almost always starts out with one simple idea: we don't know. So we are at the right starting point. Today, I want to start the conversation about what better looks like. And that doesn't just mean better for consumers or a better future energy system. It means better for researchers too. Back to that starting point, any and all research in the energy space should begin with the consumer. Consumers are not an unfortunate glitch in the system, compromising an otherwise elegant design. They are the system. What do we mean when we talk about consumers in an energy context? Many have questioned whether that's even the right word to use. After all, more than 3 million households today are also producers as well as consumers of electricity in the system we already have, and that is only increasing. Our idea of the consumer is an active one. Consumers are not passive in the sense of waiting to be imprinted by the system. They have agency. They want stuff. At Energy Consumers Australia, we talk about an energy system that meets consumers' values, needs, and expectations. That's what we always must keep in mind when we set out to create research that has a real-world impact. Whether you're engaging with them or not, those values, needs, and expectations still exist. Change in the real world will not come via passive consumers who silently conform to a mental model of what they could or should be doing. All of which means there's a big shift we need to make in how we think about consumers. And it involves adding one little letter. It's an S. The biggest mistake I see repeated is thinking about research only in terms of value. We want to create value in a perfect closed system to create efficiencies, to weigh our contribution according to this impeccable logic. But actual flesh and blood consumers, they don't always make rational choices, at least not as we determine them. Their choices and behaviours stem not just from value, but from values. There's that S. And this is the part we seldom take the time to observe and engage with. Some consumers have the means and opportunity to invest in rooftop solar, in batteries, electric vehicles, all to contribute to decarbonisation. Other consumers could have the same values, but are in different circumstances. As renters, low-income households, and small businesses, they are relying on the grid and shared local resources such as neighbourhood and solar batteries. Some consumers want simplicity, others want control. Some want independence, and some might see things more in terms of shared responsibility, fairness, or community. In reality, even these ideas are reductive. Most consumers will be weighing trade-offs involving these values and more. How much complexity might I allow if it helps preserve my independence? How much independence might I cede if I know it will help my neighbour? From these values and what might be seen as social negotiations within communities emerge needs and expectations. Understanding, predicting, and building for this kind of complexity is hard, but it absolutely has to be done. And it needs to happen at the start of your research. Ideally, the initial problem or hypothesis that forms the basis of any new research project should be framed against a vision of a plausible and desirable future from the viewpoint of the consumer, not the system or the network. Things look pretty different when you see them from that angle. That's all great in theory, but now I'd like to talk through how current thinking about the energy system transition is playing out in ways that from a consumer point of view could be seen as somewhat dystopian. And while you listen in, I want you to see if you can spot the deliberate mistake. As many of you know, our energy system has a problem with rooftop solar, and it's a problem that's born of our own success. Millions of Australians have rushed to install solar panels on the rooftops, a world-leading feat that has helped consumers gain a sense of independence, while also financially benefiting by generating their own power and selling some of it back to the grid. And all this extra renewable generation has helped bring down the price of electricity for everybody, which is great. But we are fast reaching the point, and in some cases are past the point, where we have more rooftop solar energy than we can possibly use, particularly at times during the day in spring and autumn when the sun is shining, but Australians aren't using large amounts of energy for air conditioning or heating. Electricity generated from rooftop solar needs to be used or stored. Exporting it all back into the grid at levels far exceeding demand makes things unstable and can lead to system faults, blackouts, or worse. So we have a problem. Remember what I said happens next. all of those hammers come out of their toolboxes searching intently for nails. And that means we currently have 3 solutions being offered to this problem. The first is not new and is a purely regulatory or legalistic solution. New connections are prevented from exporting or face strict limits around when and how much. Even with those limits, if too many people are trying to export too much solar at certain times, the system operator will simply curtail their ability to do so or to use their own solar generation. As hammers go, this is a particularly blunt one, but it is what is happening now. It's not surprising that the hunt is on for better ideas. For economists, the answer is obvious. This is a pricing problem. Want to send a message that exporting solar during times of low or negative demand is unhelpful? You just create a mechanism to reduce benefits from doing so, or even to install some disincentives. This is where we get the policy response known as solar export pricing. There are pros and cons to such a measure, and they were canvassed through a consumer-led collaborative process, which we were part of. The final package came with guarantees of a free basic export level and both rewards and penalties, depending on when electricity is exported. It will come into effect after 1 July 2025, once proposals have been approved by the regulator. This response, the economist hammer, is not the only measure that's being pursued to fix this system-level problem. An idea you might have heard about is another response to the same challenge. It replaces fixed limits with varying limits on how much electricity a consumer can export into the grid at any given point in time. They are variously known as flexible export limits, dynamic customer connections, or dynamic operating envelopes. Pretty much everybody in the energy system who saw this idea realised it was pretty clever. It provides a way to allow consumers to connect more solar to the grid and only face constraints on exporting on the infrequent occasions when there is too much supply. That's a big change from the current reality, where we sometimes constrain the consumer from even connecting solar in the first place if there's a perceived threat to the network from excess exports just a few times a year. So a number of the network businesses, the ANU, partners in the Distributed Energy Integration Program, together have been further developing this idea as a way to create a more flexible way of managing exports that doesn't involve the market and pricing. So we've had the regulatory response and the economist's response, and this then is the engineer's response. All of these responses could provide the benefit of allowing more Australians to continue adding solar to their rooftops and avoid wasting some of this energy at times when it could be useful. Do you remember I asked you to keep an ear out for the deliberate mistake? How did you go? It turns out it was the very first sentence I said after making that request. Our energy system has a problem with rooftop solar. I imagine most of you probably nodded along as I said this. You know about this problem and this way of thinking about it. This is our current paradigm, the problem as seen from the perspective of the system. But here's the thing. Millions of Australians who are generating solar electricity on their roof to meet their own energy needs and exporting what they don't need see this as a helpful thing, a noble thing even. They don't think this for no reason. Before we had market-based feed-in tariffs, we rewarded solar exports at high subsidised rates. We supported the highest rate of solar production per capita anywhere in the world, directly funded by consumers. And of this, we can be rightly proud. And then all of a sudden, we want them to stop. And we have 3 different and somewhat bewildering controls to making them stop. Bewildering to consumers because mostly they are complex, and it isn't easy to comprehend when they will apply and why. That is why earlier this year we raised the need for building social license for these controls. Nor do these controls in themselves inform consumers what action they can take to being adversely impacted. The architects of these controls are courageously relying on a market coming into being that will support willing buyers and sellers of solar exports and resolving these choices for consumers. But in this market, there will be many providers, each with their own interests, including technology companies, installers, and intermediaries, including retailers and aggregators. What possibly could go wrong? We can go on with developing or implementing better safeguards, as we have been doing, so the system can operate with what we expect to be 6 million Australians with solar by 2030. Or we can turn what is now a negative into a positive by involving consumers in developing a more desirable future. We know that homes and small businesses will use more electricity, not less, given the inevitable electrification of transport and heating. So it makes no sense to have the electricity generated by solar going to waste. You may have also heard me say earlier that the electricity generated by rooftop solar needs to be used or stored. So it's time that we set about solving how much more electricity can be used during the day and what is not used is stored. This is a system challenge we would face, even if solar was generated in front of the meter. If we can shift all hot water heating and a significant proportion of electric vehicle charging to during the day, we can soak up what is currently excess solar. Heating and cooling will continue to be in high demand when we're at home, simply because our housing is not insulated. The way to bridge the gap is storage. We're already seeing neighbourhood and shared storage options that are affordable and accessible for people with solar generation to bank their excess and use it later in the day. But we also ignore at our peril the need to reduce the overall level of heating and cooling demand and to reduce future system costs by retrofitting more than 8 million homes to be well insulated, with a priority fixing rental and low-income properties. Sounds simple, except changing social practice is not easy. They exist for a reason. They are so embedded that they are likely to confound any attempts to use automation to override people's choices. So we need to fill in those we don't know spaces I shared earlier through research. Social science research and collaboration is already playing a powerful role in this space and must continue to do so. Together with Monash University, Ausgrid and AusNet Services, we are partners in the $2.3 million Digital Energy Futures project. The project is generating new knowledge by employing digital ethnography and sociological theories to investigate how changing social practices will impact on electricity sector planning. Australia is also playing a major role in the International Energy Agency's technical collaboration program with Monash and the University of New South Wales undertaking a research program on the social licence to automate. The final report has developed important insights about levels of acceptance of automation based on real-world trials with consumers. Energy Consumers Australia is hoping to continue to support this work with the backing of the Australian government. We are also collaborating with the ANU's Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program to support translational research into the lived experience of consumers and their role in the energy transition. And as the CRC race for 2030 moves to the next stage, we are seeing opportunities for research that involves consumers as being central to their work. Make no mistake, fully involving consumers in our research is hard, but that is not why so many of us or researchers don't do it. As thinkers and researchers, we're not afraid of hard. We often gravitate to the big problems and challenges. After all, that's where the opportunity for maximum impact lies. But it's also true that things that are messy and murky are confronting. Fierce as they are, we prefer to take on the monsters we can see with the tools we already have, rather than the mysterious dragons that lurk beyond the limits of our experience. It's not particularly helpful for me to sit here and lecture you all about engaging with consumers in a meaningful and ongoing way through your research and building our shared knowledge without offering a way of doing that. A method of engaging with consumers that I think shows huge promise is the idea of living labs. They are in the field, real life, well-supported experiments in changed ways of living over a few weeks or months. They are ways of learning about the extent to which people are prepared to modify their lives in response to a new product or service, and what the nature of those modifications can be and why. Living labs are important for two reasons. Often consumers cannot make decisions about alternative choices in the abstract or on a cost-benefit analysis or in isolation. They need the lived experience. Living labs also provide an opportunity to go beyond asking consumers what they think they might do, creating a situation in which they can co-design what they would do. It is also a safe place to experiment, to make a mistake and try again. In the UK, a living lab run by Energy Systems Catapult offers researchers, policymakers, and other innovators the chance to design, test, and refine their ideas in real-world consumer settings across 500 volunteer households. For researchers and policymakers, the offer is clear. Such labs allow householders or small businesses to try out new energy-consuming practices, seeing how related practices will be impacted, and then receiving help in reconfiguring those practices so that it becomes more viable to sustain them over time. It's an opportunity to see if the dragons are friendly before sailing over the horizon. So in closing, my remarks today are as much a personal journey as they are a reflection on the state of research and how it supports the people's energy transition. My journey has taken me from finding fixes to problems, often with the best of intentions and often necessary, to visioning a future. A richer future that might be possible if we just lift our eyes for a moment and reach out our course in the direction of those scary dragons. I am hopeful, and I know we can do it together, as many of us have been doing in recent years. Collaboration is hard, but it is very worthwhile because it has a better chance of succeeding in realising the goals set by consumers. And that goal is an energy future that is better than today. Better because energy is clean, it's abundant, it's affordable, and we arrive together. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Lynn. I think there's been some positive little comments sneaking in, and I think nice of you to challenge around sort of what is the basis for research and how we can bring that, and also the ideas also, I think, around the role that living labs are playing. Because one of the things that comes through quite often when we're out talking to communities is the uncertainty that people are having to face as they hear about the transition, but in their day-to-day. And I always think about that, when we live and work in the energy space, it's such a large part of what we think about. But for many people beyond, it's really that, what's the switch on the wall, or, when solar came in, how do I invest in those and those sorts of things. So I think it's very helpful to think about that. What would be your, I suppose, if you think about all of the stuff that you've done through ECA and so forth, I might just jump off to say, what would be the one thing that you think would really, obviously you've talked about living laboratories, would really make a difference now where we're at, if we're thinking about this speeding up? What are some of the things that we, would be that number one thing would be your priority from an energy consumer's point of view?
It's a great question, Peter, and I think it's really the setup for what we're doing and what we think we might do in 2022 or explore ways of doing, which is, and maybe the pandemic's constrained a lot of this. Mm-hmm. But I guess to the sort of comments you've just made, we, as people who are deeply enmeshed in the system, we have deeply technical conversations a lot of the time. We're just not often enough sitting down with real people and understanding their real lived experience in the context of what we're trying to do. We do tend to do it, and I guess that was sort of one of the key themes of what I was saying, is we tend to do it after the event, and we actually might come up with better solutions. We might not actually even need to spend more time than we already do, but the time we spend now on building social license for things that are, as I talked about, complex, necessary safeguards, we could actually spend more time engaging with real people and getting insights and actionable insights to actually inform policy and design. So that's really the challenge I posed us at ECA for 2022, to actually do that. It could be deliberative forums, it could be more of that. Citizens' juries on complex questions. It's not enough. I mean, it's important to do surveys. It's important to do trials, but you still don't know. Some of the technology people talk about how things work in the wild. So, and it's no mistake. I talked about here be consumers and here be dragons. We've got this nice sort of lab kind of mentality that we've developed a technology. We've ironed out all the wrinkles, and now we hand it over to a consumer, and it doesn't work, or they don't like it, or it doesn't work as we intended. So it's on us, but I guess I'm really saying I'm calling out for partners and people to go on that adventure with us in 2022.
Yeah, that's great. I would encourage anyone, if they want to put questions into the Q&A. I think we talk a lot in my world about the social shaping of technology, and I've always said you can't start that early enough, because if you can bring that in, you can, and we talk a lot in the STS world about unintended consequence. And so wherever you can circumvent that, I think it really actually makes a difference to thinking around that. So that engaging early in all those different ways. And I also think that's not a one size fits all, as you would know through all the different consumer groups that you've talked about, you know, what it means for someone living in regional Australia versus the city is actually quite different. I'm just looking here. There is a question that I might read out from Greg Morrison. It says, thanks, Lynn. Great talk. Building automation is coming fast and needs integration with people's practices. Living lab is one approach and customer engagement another, but how do we get the research going? You've sort of started to answer that, but yeah, what would be your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I think it's partly, trying to find, we're all strapped, I guess, in our various roles or resources constrained in our various roles. So that's, I guess, something that I'm thinking of doing next year. I mean, setting up living labs is not easy. Setting up deliberative forums is not necessarily, it's not necessarily hugely expensive, but I think that's really where we've got to go. So more than happy to talk to any of the universities. I'm certainly talking to my own colleagues within the sort of official family, if you like, to say we need to do more of this. Yeah. Because to the point of this conference, I mean, I guess I opened by saying I think speed's not the thing, but we can't lag behind on really engaging consumers in the design of the future.
No. I think it's something, and I can just add that we, with COVID, had to take our citizens panels, went over 3 weeks online, and it was actually interesting, obviously through Zoom. I think it was effective. We were able to sort of show that, but also it did save a lot of money. And it is that thing, because actually I always talk about, the cost of engagement comes up, but to me it's the investment to circumvent things moving forward. Absolutely. So there's a question here from Anna Bruce. Has much research been done on consumer attitudes towards energy data sharing, and how can we balance privacy issues with the importance of data? I'm sure you can speak to that just to give a little bit of insight, Lynn.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, Anna, and I do think it's a bit of a neglected one in Australia. We've sort of thought so much about the need for data and it being ubiquitous. You touched on something that I wanted to pick up, that Consumers Federation International did a number of years ago on almost like the social license for data sharing. And it came out of more the comms background, but it's a really good piece of inter-country research on what does it take to build trust for data sharing. So I think it is a really important thing that we need to work on. So nothing at this stage, but good to raise it. And I'd observed that, with the consumer data right on energy, there's also a data strategy out of the Energy Security Board. And this is really not a space that they've actually tackled. So it is a gap.
Right. And following on from that, there's a question actually from Peter's list. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, Peter. Do we see solutions for excess solar in the grid, especially during daytime, will be implemented at the national level or more likely at state level? And are there issues of any of both of these approaches from your perspective or from the consumers?
I guess the easy way to answer that is states really still have the primary responsibility for energy. I mean, it's the nexus between energy and climate that's caused us all grief until, more recently. So it is really states, but I guess what I would like to see is to build the dialogue between the states in a way that perhaps we used to do a bit more before the pandemic, but for various reasons around climate policy, pandemics, states have felt the need to more go it alone. But I think they can all learn from each other. Many of them, and obviously I work nationally, but it also means I work in 6 states and 2 territories. there isn't a government in the country that is not in some way addressing energy efficiency, that is not addressing storage opportunities, that are not, they're all looking at heat pump technologies. Most of them have policies and programs, which I think is for the most critical group in terms of not leaving people behind, is people in rental properties and people who don't own a roof. So whether it's low income or not low income. So I guess it's really trying to create that kind of sense of momentum that it's happening across the country and that we learn from experiences in each state. And then what I'd really say is what's really missing, which goes to your national point, is a sense of the scale of what's required. And that's another factor where, a lot of this is consumer investment, and what we really need to be thinking about is what level of shared investment is there by industry, by government, as well as consumer investment, and creating plans and programs whereby people can actually, navigate this transition in their home. It's not as simple as everybody will have solar. I mean, all the numbers suggest we're going to top out at 6 million. That leaves half the population without a roof or, without a roof space or renting that won't have solar. So we can't afford that kind of energy divide. We actually need to have a joined up solution. And that's where I think the sort of national conversation and national sense of what the scale of the target is to decarbonise homes by 2050.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. We're running out of time very quickly, but I'm going to quickly get in the one that's got the most lights from Ariel. If you had to pick one thing, or maybe two, that needs to be understood or researched with respect to people, consumers, that would make a huge difference to meeting 1.5 trajectory, what would it be?
I think it's, maybe I'll have a go at two. Thank you, Ariel. The first one, I think, is how do we establish social practice around electric vehicle charging in the middle of the day? That's an imperative, and it's not leave it to consumers to sort of work it out and then tell them they've got it wrong. We can create the infrastructure that, and therefore the new normal social practice for charging vehicles in the middle of the day as the most common way of charging. And we've just got to provide the infrastructure and the incentives and the fast charging and all of the kind of convenience. So that's number one. But number two, and this comes from my background, is I think we just glibly gloss over the problem of the mismatch between the timing of heating and cooling, particularly if we're going to electrify everything. And it's unreasonable to, given uninsulated houses, people can't shift that load to the middle of the day. So we're going to have to work out the most cost-effective way, but also what is going to have the greatest social license, which is, what is actually the solution that consumers want. Because what they will continue to want is to be cool in their homes when it's hot and warm in their homes when it's cold, and when they're home. We don't want price signals or incentives that are going to simply say to people the choice should be to go without those things. That's not what we can do as part of a transition.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I am very aware of the time, so we are going to have to wrap it up. But Lynn, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and also trying to, highlight some of the areas where research can actually make a difference and some of the challenges that we're facing. I think everyone online will look forward to engaging with you on this topic as we move forward. And I think it's, one of the things that comes out of this, the need for collaboration. I think I heard today, collaboration, and also getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, which I think transition is what happens. And so how can we help to solve some of those issues? I would like to thank everyone online for their questions and for participating. As this one closes off, you've got a 5-minute break, I think, to then join us in the next room where our plenary speakers are Dr. Catherine Woodthorpe AO, Deputy Chair of RACE for 2030 CRC, and John Utzon, CEO of Race for 2030 CRC. And they, of course, will be presenting on Race for 2030, so this speedy transition, innovation for the energy decarbonisation transformation. So thank you, and thank you, audience, for your questions. Thanks, Lynn. Lovely to have you on board.